There we go. All right. So thanks very much for having me. I'm really excited to be able to share this work with you all and to hear your thoughts after the talk. So this work on opportunity zones and climate gentrification, it comes in at the end, and it's actually an outgrowth of my primary research project that's more concerned with understanding how public water and energy utilities have become enrolled in the Detroit and Puerto Rico bankruptcies. So while I've been immersed in trying to understand what's going on in Puerto Rico for a few years now, I'm only just turning to this aspect of things. And so in a way, today's talk is going to be kind of led by a deeper analysis of that earlier research. And then I'm going to turn to some preliminary thoughts and new directions at the end that hopefully you guys will enjoy both kind of halves of the presentation. So at this point in my thinking, you can tell that graphic design is a strength of mine here. This Venn diagram is pretty much how I'm thinking about how this new work connects with my work on utilities. And hopefully you can see like the background is a little snapshot, not of the entire San Juan metro area, but essentially just of the little peninsula of Old San Juan and Puerta de Tierra. And so I've kind of, hopefully you can see, like, got this little arrow to this little dark spot right there where I've marked Laura's house, and Laura is a big figure in this work. So at the heart of both of these issues, utility privatization from financial crisis and these opportunity zones as a recovery policy, sits Puerta de Tierra and Laura's apartment building, which I subletted from them during my stay there in 2019. So I want to emphasize that this isn't the only place that I think these kind of overlapping phenomena are happening, but it's rather the place where I've experienced their overlapping. And this is actually something I think is happening all over working class districts in Puerto Rico. So in order for you to see how they overlap, I'm going to try and give you, briefly give you a story of what's going on both the left and the right spheres of, sorry, I'm just not going to be able to pay attention to the chat. That was my distraction point. But so basically this talk is, I'm going to tell you what's going on in the left and the right spheres of this Venn diagram through two case studies that begin and end kind of respectively at Laura's house. So yeah, if anybody needs to tell me anything, just unmute yourself because I just took chat off. Okay, so so this is a little, like, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my theoretical orientation going into this here. So I studied the racialization of urban finance using the theoretical lens of racial capitalism and the methodological approach of relational comparison. At this point, hopefully racial capitalism doesn't need an introduction to its theorists, but just in case, the person primarily associated with this framework that we use for understanding how racial hierarchies and capitalism are co-constituted is Cedric Robinson. But of course, Robin Kelly and Geography's own Ruth Wilson Gilmore, among many others, have done so much work on this concept as well. So in terms of relational comparison, my main source of inspiration for this approach is Gillian Hart. So like Hart, I'm interested in relational comparison for what it can tell us about how structures of domination and oppression that comprise this larger system of racial capitalism itself, how they manifest locally and conjuncturally. So for example, how does the racialization of urban finance work in Detroit, which has the largest technically municipal bankruptcy in US history, versus Puerto Rico, which isn't allowed to declare bankruptcy, but it has a much larger insolvency issue. So how is that going on? How is that working in Detroit and Puerto Rico? What sorts of geographies are involved in the production and reproduction of racial capitalism in these places, but also what kinds of freedom dreams are being plotted within each of these places as well. So I'm going to use two vignettes from my first visit to Puerto Rico in 2019 to try and convey to you how financial recovery policies aimed at ostensibly helping Puerto Rico recover from municipal bankruptcy on the one hand, this is the PROMESA legislation, and Hurricane Maria on the other hand, this is the opportunity zone policy, in my opinion, are working to reproduce coloniality and racial capitalist urban futures. So the first section does this for the PROMESA legislation and looks primarily at my research on utility privatization and how it's both perpetrating climate injustice and impacting everyday life. The second section is the preliminary work on opportunity zones. And so opportunity zones are essentially in the US a new framework of federal and local tax incentives meant to encourage reinvestment in economically distressed areas. Most state governments on the mainland are limited to designating around 25% of their territories, their cities mostly, as opportunity zones. But in Puerto Rico, it's between 95 and 98% of the island that's been designated as an opportunity zone. So that's kind of that plan for the talk. So Christopher Columbus discovered the island of Boricua, now called Puerto Rico, on his second trip to the Caribbean in 1493. There's a massive statue in the middle of Old San Juan memorializing the occasion that you can see here. Bronze plaques encircle the base of the pillar the statue stands on, mythologizing Columbus's arrival and encounter with the indigenous people of the island, the Taino, while the statue itself shows Columbus with his left hand held high, seemingly pointed up at the heavens, holding onto a flag with the Christian cross mounted on top. There's a saying in Puerto Rico about this very statue that's cuando Colón baje el dedo, that basically equates to the English idiom of when pigs fly. But it directly translates to when Columbus puts his finger down. It's used when a person wants to imply that the thing you're talking about, whatever it is, it will come to fruition in the same metaphorical moment that the statue of Columbus lowers his finger, which obviously is to say will never happen. So I was in Puerto Rico in the early part of 2019 doing an initial round of field work on the urban afterlives of PROMESA, the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act passed by US Congress in 2016 in response to the financial crisis and insolvency of the American territory. On one of my final days there, one of my collaborators, Laura, whose pronouns are they, them, mentioned an issue they were having with the water department, the Puerto Rico Aqueducts and Sewers Authority, PRASA in English. It goes by its acronym AAA in Spanish. Laura was living in a working class district of Old San Juan called Puerta de Tierra. Laura explained that the water pipes in their building were old and in bad shape, and the water meters being used to calculate usage and billing rates had been dysfunctional since Hurricane Maria hit the island in September 2017. In fact, since then, the water department had been issuing bills to the residents of the building with only estimates of usage, which according to Laura were really super exaggerated. And by the time we spoke in February 2019, they had already personally accumulated thousands in debt to the water department for their small one-bedroom apartment due to broken meters and inaccurate bill estimates. They pay a monthly fee, but now also have to file an in-person grievance against the excessive charges every month. Otherwise, they not only risk having their water shut off, but their credit score affected, as well as the ability to open other utility accounts in their name, including water services at future residences they may move to. The water department has told them that they, the water department, need to install new water meters before they can resolve the overbilling issue, but in the same breath revealed that the water meter company originally installed the meters left Puerto Rico super long time ago and is now only based in Texas. So before Laura can resolve this whole debt issue that's hanging over their head, they, along with everybody else in the building in the city who have this same problem, have to wait for water meters to come in from Texas. So one time, after months of going through the same routine over and over again, Laura frustratedly asked the water department rep with whom they're filing their monthly grievance, like, hey, how long does it take for a water meter to be shipped here from Texas? And the person behind the counter looked at Laura and said, you'll get your new water meter cuando Colón baje el dedo. So they're never gonna get those water meters. I wanted to use this idiomatic expression in this story about Laura's imposed, never-ending water debt to start investigating the more than metaphorical dynamics of colonialism at work in Puerto Rico's insolvency and recovery process. The ongoing extractive relationship between Puerto Rico and the US is well researched, but in recent years, this analysis has centered around narratives of disaster more so than the territory's enrollment in US municipal finance. Congress passed the PROMESA legislation that I came to Puerto Rico to research in response to the island's declaration of insolvency in the municipal bond market. So it owes it's in debt by about $74 billion in that market. And a follow-up ruling by the US Supreme Court that, unlike many local governments on the American mainland, Puerto Rico has no legal right to access bankruptcy laws. It just can't. So at stake in PROMESA is the mandated repair and redevelopment of Puerto Rico's two major public utilities, the island's water and electricity departments respectively, both of which owe billions of dollars to their municipal bondholders. Specific plans under PROMESA involve the creation of a public-private partnership to outsource the installation of a $400 million smart water meter system, primarily designed to prevent water theft, and the conversion of Puerto Rico's electric power generation to privately owned natural gas facilities, even though Puerto Rico has no natural gas fields of its own, and studies have shown that if developed, its wind and solar resources could provide more than 100% of the island's electricity needs. Laura's encounter with the water department illustrates that the U.S. territory's fraught relationship with American municipal finance is also intersecting with spaces of social reproduction in strange ways. Utility account holders, for example, face the additional labor of filing monthly grievances and face personal financial exposure regarding falsely inflated bills, while the water system itself, which is 95% residential use, remains under-maintained and considered to be an extremely, people just don't trust it. So there's a relational production of space at work between Puerto Rico's imposed method of financial recovery and feminist considerations of social reproduction that need to be taken into account. In line with Goldstein's rejoinder that the, quote, multiple valences of reproduction are key for analyzing the co-constitutive dynamics of racial capitalism and settler colonialism, unquote, this paper aims to show how and why the maintenance and repair of essential urban infrastructures can also be used as sites for the social reproduction of both settler colonialism and racial capitalism. So it's hard to have an image for a literature review. I apologize for the boring slide. But large infrastructural projects have long been recognized as the province of state building, whether for ideological reasons or more recently as demonstrated by Naomi Klein in the aftermath of crisis or disaster. The rich literature surrounding infrastructure provides critical assessments of structural conditions incentivizing particular projects from a variety of perspectives and methodologies. And many of these analyses are deeply skeptical of the underlying project, or they're ambivalent at best. Yet when it comes to a particular class of infrastructural projects, those that are connected to meeting basic physiological needs of contemporary society, most studies, regardless of epistemological approach, tend to come from the perspective of wanting that project to be successful. So while Gandhi may, for example, question the role of governmentality in his research on the production of modern and post-colonial urban water systems, it's super clear that he believes in the project of distributed water infrastructure. For cities especially, the basic provision and operational presence of essential formalized infrastructures such as housing, water, sewerage, and electrical power is on the whole still taken to be indicative of economic and social progress rather than domination and oppression, though see Gergen 2024 an exception to this. Current literature on the maintenance and repair of infrastructure in particular is almost completely focused on analyzing this class of essential infrastructure specifically, and it kind of tends to present a clear-cut case for understanding attempts at the rehabilitation of aging or environmentally unsound essential infrastructure systems as unquestionably good, while unintentionally or not, blackboxing the means by which this has been or will be accomplished. What is often missing here is an understanding of how these formal, universalized, essential infrastructure systems, while providing a public good, are simultaneously mechanisms for the embedding and reproduction of unjust social, economic, and political relations at the urban level. Using the lens of social reproduction to understand the relationalities at work in the provision, maintenance, and repair of such essential infrastructure systems has the power to unveil oppressive architectures of urban organization. It also gives rise to questions about why we should seek to maintain such infrastructures, even essential ones, that give life to and sustain violent dynamics. Using the lens of social reproduction to understand the socio-spatial impacts of infrastructural maintenance or repair projects may at first seem a bit unorthodox, as current feminist literatures on social reproduction come from a Marxist tradition that overwhelmingly focuses on labor rather than infrastructure or the built environment. However, there's an expanded understanding of social reproduction that has recently, like within the past decade, I think, that's been recently used to initiate conversations on the marketization of social reproduction. And that's what I'm drawing on here. This concept of social reproduction understands the idea as not just rooted in labor, but also in terms of, quote, the creation and maintenance of communities. This expanded operationalization has tied transformed spatialities of social reproduction to changing relationships between states, markets, and governance mechanisms. Work seeking to understand how care labor has become enrolled in private equity, or understanding the role of microcredit distribution in the global South, as well as the new centrality of debt to household formation, is at the front of this research. So keeping that in mind, in league with others, contending that everyday life is a potent site for enacting political rupture through processes of social reproduction. So Mitchell in 2004 publication did that, Angel in 2019 did that. I also want to suggest that following critical disability studies and recent methodological moves in political ecology, a useful starting place for feminist reimaginings of more just relations of social reproduction is to incorporate conversations surrounding inclusive notions of embodiment. While maintaining labor-based sectoral approaches to understanding social reproduction is definitely important, a super important political strategy under capitalism, the concept of embodiment allows for a systemic approach to thinking through spaces and processes of social reproduction so that imaginaries of more just futures are able to take into account experiences that lay outside this labor capital relationship. This is important not only for those who are completely excluded from capitalist labor value exchange, but also for being able to envision a future where the life-sustaining practices we refer to as social reproduction don't reflect the dictates of heteropatriarchal racial capitalism. For the purposes of this research specifically, it opens up discussions of the lived experience of infrastructural systems as expressive of these dominant relations of social reproduction. And in the process, it provides new ways of relating to ideas of infrastructural maintenance and repair. If we start from the idea of embodied experiences of social reproduction, we can begin to identify the kind of relations that are being maintained and reaffirmed through specific acts of urban repair. The next section here explains in more detail the plans for the water and electric departments with the aim of showing how U.S. interests are using financial recovery policies to reinsert their domination over Puerto Rico via these two bedrock institutions, the water and electric utilities. And I mostly focus on the electric utility here just because it's super foundational even to the water utility. It also has a more interesting story. So Puerto Rico currently occupies an extremely vivid position in the American imaginary. This is certainly not the historical norm. This is also primarily due to the devastation wrought by Hurricane Maria in 2017. More lives were lost to Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico than the Gulf Coast lost to Katrina in 2005. It's been called the most devastating natural disaster in the US in more than 100 years. One of the reasons the hurricane was so disastrous is because of the island's underfunded and under-maintained power grid was essentially destroyed by the storm, leaving Puerto Ricans to recover from the aftermath of a Category 5 hurricane without electrical power. This sustained blackout following the hurricane led to a second swath of deaths as refrigerated medicines like insulin expired in the heat and as water systems shut down without the power to run them, becoming contaminated with infectious bacteria that then spread to people who continued to use this system because they had no other source of water. We now know that the secondary wave of deaths was on a far greater scale than the initial numbers of people whose deaths were lost to the hurricane itself. However, Puerto Rico's economic, well, I should say there's, the hurricane is a huge reason why Puerto Rico is currently in the popular imaginary in the US so much. There are other more recent events like the resignation of Ricardo Rossello, the governor. I don't have time to get into that, but I'm super happy to talk more about it in Q&A. But so to get back to this, the decline of the electrical grid and the Puerto Rico's corresponding economic decline has been decades in the making. Puerto Rico's economic decline, as you can see illustrated here, has been at least a decade in production prior to the 2017 hurricane season. The island has been facing structural economic deterioration and recession since at least 2006, when capital gains tax protections for corporations relocating to Puerto Rico expired. Manufacturing and pharmaceutical sectors that had taken up residence on the island, there were kind of like clusters of these industries there. They were decimated by firms repatriating back to the states, the mainland, after the tax protections were repealed. And this situation is what prompted Puerto Rico to borrow massively on the municipal bond market to make up for this absence of industry. So after that kind of evacuation by industry, along with a breakdown of into its largest components. Only one of these pieces of debt has been restructured so far under PROMESA, which is the COFINA debt right here. COFINA is just an acronym that represents a related series of bonds issued under a sales tax that was passed to promote fund economic development projects in Puerto Rico. This cluster of debt has been restructured by PROMESA so that senior bondholders, most of these people who own these bonds are hedge funds, will receive 93 cents on the dollar. So this is not really a restructuring. And that's the only thing that's been handled. Much like all these other Puerto Rican governmental authorities who are insolvent, PREPA also borrowed on the market to maintain operations. However, it also knew that it needed to fund not just operational costs, but to undergo major repairs and environmental upgrades as well. So it borrowed even more money to support those upgrading efforts. And all when PREPA declared that it was insolvent, which it did months before the Puerto Rican government itself did, the utility had about $9 billion outstanding in municipal debt, as you can see here. A major issue, however, is the nature of the planned upgrades the utility borrowed that money to complete. So the first major proposed project was the construction of what was to be a privately owned and operated gas port, the Aguirre Offshore Gas Port, AOGP, an industrial facility that would import and regasify liquefied natural gas, a fossil fuel known for volatile price fluctuations and the environmentally harmful extraction process called fracking, and sending it ashore via an underwater pipeline. The AOGP was planned to be located on a barge 4 miles off the southern coast of Puerto Rico, adjacent to the Aguirre power plants, which is also slated to have its generators converted to run off of natural gas. Because the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that the territory of Puerto Rico has no recourse to municipal bankruptcy laws, at the time of its initial declaration of insolvency, PREPA was, in a very real sense, at the mercy of its creditors. One of the stipulations required by PREPA's creditors was for the public utility to put together a development plan that included this Aguirre offshore gas port. It was presented by PREPA's municipal bond creditors as a logical solution to their own restructuring stipulations. It was also something that gas and oil interests had been trying for years to accomplish. So while these negotiations were going on, the US Congress passed PROMESA, and so the act mandates a presidentially appointed 7-member financial oversight and management board, the FOMB, which is universally called the junta on the island, with complete authority over the territory's budgets and responsibility for restructuring the island's entire package of debt. So tellingly, however, PROMESA was conceived and is currently being managed by the U.S. House Committee on Natural Resources. This is where the financial management of all U.S. territories are located. Further to the point that the U.S. views Puerto Rico more as a resource, a natural resource, than a polity. Among the lead architects of the financial restructuring package in PROMESA was Bill Cooper, the former president of the Center for Liquefied Natural Gas. So under PROMESA, PREPA's like declaration of insolvency and everything its creditors were making it do in terms of the Aguirre offshore gas port, all of that stuff was folded into the junta's kind of mandate. And so the Aguirre offshore power plant like actually subsequently stalled and was eventually canceled because of this change. So that's like a cool win. But it has instead been made clear by the junta that plans for the wholesale privatization of the utility of PREPA will still take place as soon as possible, ideally within 2 years, and the island's entire power grid will still be converted to run off of imported natural gas. So like nothing is really changing, it's just that one specific project isn't there anymore. What vested interests have in mind for Puerto Rico's debt restructuring and economic recovery then is to use it to renew and redevelop its structural reliance upon the fossil fuel economy. This is the very thing that is causing the rising intensity of hurricane season year over year, which the island is particularly vulnerable to. In fact, while I was there, a brand new liquefied natural gas company with the neo-colonial name New Fortress Energy held its IPO on NASDAQ. This company was established with the sole purpose of converting 2 San Juan power stations to run off of natural gas and developing a liquefied natural gas terminal at the port of San Juan. The company is, moreover, using the contract it got from PREPA to make the IPO, and it's using funds from its IPO to do the project. So there's some circular logic at work that makes it really hard to understand precisely what qualifications New Fortress Energy initially submitted to PREPA to earn the contract in the first place. This contract and subsequent IPO were also completed months before PREPA submitted its plans for this project to its regulatory agency. So materially speaking, Puerto Rico is now host to a multi-billion-dollar project that the private sector created and contractually established before the proposal was brought before regulators. And that project is to forcefully bring natural gas into the port and city of San Juan by way of a new fortress. The project of bringing natural gas facilities to San Juan and the San Juan port is something that has been fought against for years by Puerto Rican environmentalists and other citizens, not least for its adverse environmental impacts, but also because of the dangers of warehousing such flammable material within the confines of a super dense urban port. So for the sake of time, I'm going to leave the utility conversation here, but I just wanted to briefly mention that the public water utility also has a long history of failed runs at privatization prior to the current smart water meter initiative. Each prior contract with these private operators has left this water utility further in debt and with increased environmental violations. And like I think I mentioned before, I'm definitely happy to talk more about this in the Q&A if anyone is interested. But essentially, the exposure of Puerto Ricans to urban insolvency and U.S. dictated methods for recovery shows us that municipal debt is not a universally homogeneous experience, but mediated through colonial spatialities and histories of racial capitalism in the Caribbean. It also shows us that PROMESA is substantively not really about providing debt relief as much as it is a legal geography built to maintain extractive flows from the island and to ensure the continued dependency of Puerto Rico's economy to the U.S. and other transnational interests. with the reconstruction of their electrical grid and water system being used as primary conduits to do so. Okay, so now in this last part, we're moving from the left side of that Venn diagram of the utilities and opportunity zones to the right side, and the second vignette that I want to tell you about. So about 2 weeks before, I was hanging out with Laura, and they told me that story about their water debt and the encounter with the rep, the sassy rep at the water department. I was enrolled in a intensive Spanish course with the aim of trying to spruce up my language skills for this research project. One of the people who started the program in the same intake as me was this guy we'll call Dave. Dave was definitely from Texas. It's a funny thing, but when you are kind of trying to learn a language, the easiest thing to do is to talk about yourself. And this is what most instructors ask you to do, actually. So you end up learning a lot of personal details about these random people that you're learning the language with, and the same, it goes both ways. So Dave was from Texas, and he and his family had just moved to Puerto Rico for 2 years. He had his truck shipped out from Texas to be brought to Puerto Rico. Like, it was a whole big thing. So he was moving here for 2 years because he worked at a construction company specializing in disaster recovery and infrastructural repair. And it's this one you see here in this slide, SLS. And one day he missed class, and when he returned, he said, oh yeah, I couldn't come yesterday because I had to go out and look at a building that we might want to work on, but there was too much damage for us, so we didn't take it. Asked him to kind of explain what he meant by that, and he said, well, have you heard of opportunity zones? That's why my company sent me down, but if a building has too much damage, then we can't take it on. It's not going to be profitable in the long run. So this is my first kind of introduction to opportunity zones, and they piqued my interest, but I had set them aside to focus on the utility thing until now. So basically, opportunity zones were established as part of Trump's Tax Cuts and Jobs Acts of 2017. So PROMESA is in 2016. This tax cuts thing is in 2017. And this opportunity zones, well, 95 to 98% of Puerto Rico has been declared to be an opportunity zone. So, like I said previously, most states only designate about 25% of their areas as such. So for essentially the entire island to have this designation is not in keeping with what's happening elsewhere. The structure of these tax incentives can vary from the federal level to the local level. So at the federal level, they include reprieves on capital gains taxes on sales of properties in opportunity zones, or investments. You don't have to pay capital gains tax on investments in opportunity zone projects, and like a whole kind of host of other little options. At the local level, a lot of states and municipalities are also throwing in local tax relief packages as well. So the Puerto Rican governor, Rosello, I don't know if it's gone through since he had to resign, but he was initially proposing up to a 75% discount on municipal taxes for opportunity zone ventures. And I mean, the whole island is an opportunity zone. So what is that going to mean for tax receipts for these localities? So I was real quick while we were waiting online for everybody to join us. I'm glad that happened because I had the opportunity to make this slide. A lot of voices are sounding, warning bells about how this opportunity zone policy, which is meant to invest in the infrastructural repair and maintenance of low-income communities, is actually leading to the gentrification of low-income communities, especially those ideally situated close to urban cores or other hubs. So this is the Fed, the central bank of the US, has even made a map of those mainland communities most at risk of displacement from opportunity zone investment. So this is an example that I pulled from Detroit. Like, this is downtown Detroit essentially. And so they've identified these census tracts in orange as being most at risk from opportunity zone displacement. They did not make a map for Puerto Rico, which I think is interesting, and maybe we can take up in the Q&A, but I think it has to do with the way they measure gentrification. based on whiteness. So, but anyway, getting back to this, essentially, I mean, opportunity zones are supposed to be for the infrastructural repair and upkeep of low-income communities, but what's happening here, a lot of people think, is that it's basically just a giant renoviction scheme. So with this, little segue in mind, let's go back to my friend Laura in Puerta de Tierra. In September 2019, after years of fighting with the water department regarding inflated bills, everyone who lived in Laura's building was notified that they were all being evicted, and this was the eviction notice that they received. As the building had just been sold to an investor from New York who had recently purchased properties and established 4 different LLCs around the San Juan metro area over the months of July and August of 2019. The new owner of the building is the CEO of VMS Capital Group, which describes its business as specializing in the, quote, acquisition of distressed residential real estate properties. Laura's building was located in a working class district that still had visible damage left over from Hurricane Maria, like most of the island does. But it was not distressed, save for being legally designated as such by Opportunity Zones legislation. So Laura's building was not distressed as conventionally understood, but rather as legally determined. Their building was not distressed, but they were within about 30 minutes walking distance of the heart of Old San Juan, and even closer to the massive cruise ports, sundry shops, and a host of beloved cultural landmarks and beautiful beaches. A commercial bakery without a cafe anchored Laura's block, while a small hardware shop fronted the ground floor of their apartment building. Faded murals decorate walls along sidewalks of Puerta de Tierra, even as lights of giant cruise boats blink in the distance at night. Their building was not distressed, but it was cheap rent and the perfect location for redevelopment. Until very recently, I got an update from Laura this past Monday saying there seemed to be activity in the building. Until then, essentially, the building sat empty from their eviction last November, so a year essentially, awaiting transformation into high-end apartments while an art gallery is set to replace the hardware shop. With the residents evicted and the building laying empty and wait for some sort of redevelopment suitable for much wealthier, likely expat residents and short-stay vacationers, there's virtually no chance now to have those water meters installed to get accurate reflections of the average amounts of water that was being used prior to redevelopment. The false debt incurred from this issue will follow these tenants from residence to residence as they transfer water utility counts from their name to new households. Yet this renoviction, on paper at least, appears as evidence of the repair and revitalization of Puerto Rico. And this is an insight that Brandy Summers and Desiree Fields helped me kind of get to and realize recently, so shout out to them. But I want to emphasize that maintenance and repair under racial capitalism does things like replace hardware shops, actually useful places of repair, with art galleries. It does things like divest working people of their homes in order to have buildings sit empty, waiting for transformation into luxury high-end apartments. On opportunity zone paper, so to speak, this building on the right, this is Laura's building. This building on the right is repaired. This building on the left is distressed. So with regard to climate gentrification, I want to argue that Laura's renoviction is clearly a case of climate change-induced displacement. As such, climate gentrification isn't something that is bound by strict empirical parameters like displacement by elites in search of higher ground, as is happening in Miami, but is rather a dynamic of urban ecological relation. It's a dynamic urban ecological relation that is empirically expressed according to different local contexts. So in Puerto Rico, it has much less to do with higher ground and more to do with financial and hurricane recovery efforts that, as Dave's company has illustrated, essentially just amount to finding and exploiting rent gaps in urban landscapes. They only fix what they can profit from fixing. And this is just the last bit here. I want to note as well, though, that on eviction day, members of Laura's community came to the building with offerings of home-cooked food meant to help recuperate people exhausted from the act of moving house, as well as free acupressure treatments intended to help relieve some of the stress and trauma of eviction. They also left a note of warning for the rest of their neighborhood. So I've just blurred out the people here, but the warning that they put up said, aquí vivía gente, Puerta de Tierra. I can't read that because it's really small on my end. But the English translation is, people lived here, Puerta de Tierra, stand up for yourself because you can be next. So that's what they told people as kind of a leaving message. There are then two very different imaginaries of Puerto Rican futurity at work in contemporary practices of urban maintenance and repair. One is clearly dominated by the continuation and maintenance of colonial debt relations, while a nascent other works to engender new spatialities of collective self-determination and reparative social healing via interpersonal connections based on love, friendship, family, and community. As just a glimpse was seen with Laura and their communities kind of offering to the building's residents on eviction day. So Puerto Rico's experience and Laura's story in particular has shown that the way we practice maintenance and repair is intimately tied to the conditions of social reproduction we intend to have, and therefore the kind of future that we are actively working on bringing into being. And that's it. Thank you so much for the talk.
Thank you so much, Sage. Really interesting, and I have some questions. I do want to open the floor up for others to add the questions into the chat, and we can work through those. Let me just pull this up. I mean, one thing I would like you to talk more about, perhaps, is this linkage you're making between the research on infrastructure and then social reproduction, which I think is really interesting. This idea that a lot of the literature kind of implies that these infrastructure projects would be desirable, you know, if they only worked as intended. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that and the way that you kind of see your contribution to that literature, but also your kind of critiques or readings of that work.
So my whole thing about that is it just stems from watching or, you know, keeping tabs on what's happening with the PREPA and the water utility. I mean, they say they're fixing it, but if you look at the relations that are guiding the repair, they're totally oppressive and unequal, and that's being reflected in the type of repair that they're choosing to do, which is to rely on natural gas, something that Puerto Rico doesn't even have. And my efforts in trying to explain like why we can't just say it's repaired and call it good is what led me to bringing those two literatures to put them in conversation. I'm not sure if I'm doing it really successfully yet, but that's my motivation. Is to explain that relationship.
Yeah, thank you. So we have a question from Andy Lavender, who says that he's interested in learning more about how utility privatization is framed as a strategy to repair infrastructure and solve debt issues. Can you expand on this, particularly with connection to discourses of repair and maintenance?
Yeah, so in PREPA's case, they're just straight up calling it privatization, and there's heavy narrative that the public sector is the one who's completely to blame for the state of disrepair that the energy utility grid is in. And so this case is like, I would say almost a really pure example of just the neoliberalization of urban governance at work. Private is always better in this case. I think it's really striking because, I mean, the water, just right next door in Puerto Rico, you have the water utility who has had several run-ins with privatization, and they have been left holding the bag every single time. So it's striking that there's still this turn towards privatization, and I would not want to venture into why I think that is. But that's just still the heavily dominant narrative. But I also keep thinking about like conversations people are having in California with PG&E and saying like private utility operators do not maintain their grids. Yeah, I'm interested in why this narrative of privatization is still so influential. But I mean, from my experience reading about and researching what's going on in Puerto Rico and Detroit, that is the first move. Something's wrong with the public system, we got to privatize it. And only when there's heavy pushback that's successful does that slightly change.
Right. Thank you. I'm waiting for some other, I mean, I have other questions. I don't want to take up too much space. Here we have another question. Can you say a bit more about whether the people living in the building oppose their eviction? So yeah, to hear a bit more about the contestations would be really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, so this is definitely like straight up working class building. I mean, it's unclear. I didn't do surveys and I don't really know all of the people living there, but I would say that Laura was unusual in having a degree. So they protest, they like contest, they were mad, they were really angry. They asserted that they weren't given the proper 3 months notice. And at the end of the day, I believe, although I could be wrong, that they all chose not to pursue legal means. I think because a lot of people are just, their lives are so full with working already that they can't really take this on. They can't pay to take it on, but also a lot of them decided to leave without paying rent. So that was their revenge, right? They're like, you're going to kick us out, we're not going to pay you. So that's kind of how the contestation went.
Thank you. And the second part of this conversation from this question is, and how what happens, can you talk about how what happens in Puerta de Tierra links with racial capitalism? Maybe walk us through that a little bit more.
Yeah, so basically it's really interesting. Like Puerta de Tierra is the district, it's the neighborhood that borders Old San Juan, Viejo San Juan, which is, if not the wealthiest, at least like the oldest elite neighborhood district in San Juan, which is a huge metro area. But essentially, this is where the cruise boats are. This is where, if you're an expat, you either live here or maybe in Santurce. But this is where the big white people money is, to residentially speaking, at least, and tourist-wise speaking. So I would say, like, yeah, if I were to have to say, like, how is racial capitalism at work in Puerta de Tierra, distinctly, it has to do with this sudden divide. Like, it's just one of those areas where you're walking and you're in the tourist area, you're seeing the governor's mansion, you're seeing all of the state kind of capitol buildings, and then you're in this area that Laura was like, oh, you can go left on my street, but don't go right. So it's like, it's a area that's ripe for gentrification in all senses of the word. And so that's how I would say racial capitalism is at play with the white expat community, especially. They have small business owners who, I don't touch on this in this research, but there's this like really bizarre Puertopia, like cryptocurrency crew that's there, and they're in Old San Juan trying to convince all of the local business owners to sell them, the cryptocurrency people, their property in return for cryptocurrency. So yeah, there's like all kinds of avenues that you can take in terms of locating Puerta de Tierra with racial capitalism, depending on what you're interested in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the cryptocurrency bros, that's like a whole conversation to be had. Okay, we have a question from James. Is there any discussion of resilience or climate in Puerto Rico? Does climate change or resilience animate any of the projects in the opportunity zones? And if so, how is that squared with the natural gas push?
Yeah, so I would say that there is, like, I'm not a part of this. Yeah, there's definitely like a crew pushing resilience in Puerto Rico. I'm not, that's not my circle that I'm kind of following. So there's a lot of NGO work there, especially. I mean, like, okay, so I should not be so cynical, actually. There's a lot of like post-Hurricane Maria NGO interest in recovery efforts, especially around local agricultural movements. There is a woman doing like small-scale water infrastructure in mountainous, kind of very small village type situations. So they're using terms like resilience and climate change for sure. They are not in the same room with people who are doing the LNG push. These are two totally separate worlds. Almost everybody I talk to thinks it doesn't make sense for LNG to come, except for the people with the power who are like, yeah, it's clean energy. Of course, it makes so much sense and it's cheaper. So yeah, they're just not talking to each other, but there are both kind of happening.
Thank you, Sage. Any more questions? I have one question that I want to ask you because somebody asked me recently and it was a really difficult one to work through, which is just to speak a bit about this idea of relational comparison. And I was thinking about when you were addressing the question of racial capitalism in this particular neighborhood, you mentioned like the way that it manifests distinctly. And so I just wonder, like, to what end do you see this relational comparison work? Like, why are you pursuing it? Are you looking for kind of variations on a process? Are you looking for to be able to compare and generalize? Like, what for you is the purpose of this relational comparison? And maybe if you can speak about what that might mean for people that I'm not familiar with that literature.
Okay, so relational comparison is usually when people try to do compare, they're either like compare or contrast, like that's another thing, and they think, well, you have to compare apples to apples, oranges to oranges. They have to have similar ideal type structures to be able to be compared. That's like kind of the traditional orthodox thought of comparison. Relational comparison is like, no, it doesn't have to be apples to apples, but there has to be a process that you're looking at. Jillian Hart looks at white supremacy. So that's what I would say about the, relational comparison. And thanks for giving me this segue. I usually like really preview this heavily, but my bigger project is to do a relational comparison between Detroit and Puerto Rico. So that's what I'm trying to do. They have the two largest municipal bankruptcies in the US. The utility kind of transformation is really a prevalent issue and process in both of them. And so I'm trying to understand that relationally. So Detroit didn't privatize their water department, but it has kind of been long-term leased to all of the white suburbs who are contracting out with private corporations. So different forms of privatization.
Great, thank you. And that actually links very nicely to Deb's question, which is, can you tell us a bit more about where you're taking this work, both in practice, but also the kinds of questions that you're trying to think through?
Thanks, Deb. I'm so glad you could make it. In practice, I am currently working with Laura, who's a film director, and the organization that she belongs to, SEPA, Center for Embodied Pedagogy and Action, in San Juan, to create kind of a documentary. And originally the documentary was grounded in Laura's water department experience, but more and more they're kind of saying, no, this opportunity zones issue that's at the heart of a lot of things. So we're going to try and bring both of those dynamics into play. We have enough funding to do like a teaser for the Puerto Rico run. We're hoping to leverage that into more funding to create a longer documentary looking at both Detroit and Puerto Rico. I got put in touch with Laura and SEPA through a woman who is a founder of the Detroit Puerto Rico Solidarity Exchange Network. So there's already existing connections there we want to kind of move through. But to do a documentary looking at, the transformation of the water departments and the manifestation of racial capitalism in both. And in terms of the kinds of questions, I'm really starting to get into this opportunity zone stuff. I think that's like the thing that keeps coming up.
Thanks, Sage. Okay, any more questions? I'm just going to see if anyone's typing anything up. I don't want to cut you off. And just to reiterate, Sage kindly let us record her talk and this discussion, and so we will make that available and send that out via email. So you will get that shortly. Okay, there's a question from Rachel. This will probably have to be, so firstly, do you know the Puerto Rico syllabus, which I think you're familiar with?
Oh, yeah. Very awesome. Yeah, thanks for the shout out. You guys should all check out the Puerto Rico syllabus for references on this type of stuff. And then one last question, this is from Rachel. I was wondering about the logic of cost recovery and how that's structured into repair and maintenance. I'm thinking about a conversation with an engineer in Jamaica where areas that are judged as not being able to attract enough subscribers do not get infrastructure. He said this because the fees cannot be generalized. I haven't, thank you, Rachel. I'm so glad you can make it too. I haven't heard it put, well, okay, so let me back up to Dave, the guy at the construction company. I think this is he was describing this situation informally to me. So he was saying, yeah, our company is not going to repair buildings that are desperately in need of repair because the money isn't there for us. And so it's a similar phenomenon where they're cherry picking parts of the built environment to repair while leaving other buildings in enormous disrepair. And, it's dangerous to be near them. So I think that this logic of cost recovery is in the financial, and I'm used to hearing it and put in terms of risk. So is the risk of return on investment too high? And I think that this is essentially what's kind of driving a lot of the decisions in this kind of messed up social reproduction method of doing urban infrastructure maintenance and repair. So yeah, thanks for bringing that to my attention. I will have to have a further conversation with you about how the different languages or different words that are used to describe the same thing. Yeah, thank you. Oh yeah, that's, yeah. Is this the physical geography thing? Yeah, that's super good. Thank you so much, Sage. This was really wonderful and so great to hear what you've been working on. We'll be looking out for your publication in the annals. Which is very exciting. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We really hope that you enjoyed this talk and will be able to join us tomorrow morning for Sarah Kuhn's talk. I'm just watching the chat. Yeah, thank you. And this was really great, Sage. Yeah, thanks for having me. This is exciting. I'm so glad it's happening. Okay. Bye, Sage. Goodbye, everyone. Bye.
Thanks for joining.